In the name of the one who is love and compassion. Amen. Let's be seated. My eyes keep getting wet from that children's anthem every time. Today is Children's Advocacy Sunday. 2 years ago, the Children's Defense Fund founder, Mary Ann Wright Edelman, was in this pulpit right here, and she had her crumpled up notes. And every minute of her sermon, if you want to call it that, there was applause erupting in this place. Her proximity and commitment to the most vulnerable children gave rise to almost effortless power in her words. I'm not sure that I can pull that off today, but if you'd like to applaud at any point, you should feel free to do so. My favorite Christmas song is a song by Jackson Browne called The Rebel Jesus. And it's never too early to talk about Christmas music. In one verse of this song, he sings, "We guard our world with locks and guns, and we guard our fine possessions. And once a year, when Christmas comes, we give to our relations. And perhaps we give a little to the poor, if the generosity should seize us. But if any one of us should interfere in the business of why there are poor, then we'd get the same as the rebel Jesus." Giving a little to children in need is always good, but what we're really talking about today is the interference in the systems of why there is a need to dismantle what Mary Ann Wright Edelman calls the cradle-to-prison pipeline, or why guns are so easy for our young people to access in this country, or why in mass numbers children of color are left without adequate early childhood education, or why discipline in the classroom is becoming increasingly militarized, as we've seen recently, instead of being rooted in relationships of earned trust and respect. Anti-racist educator and author Tim Wise, who will be with us at All Saints in January, says that though many in our society have been good at mobilization and protest activity, it seems as though every victory has been undermined because there hasn't been a strong enough narrative to sustain them. We need better and more compassionate stories on all sides, he says, or what in academic terms he calls a counter-hegemonic narrative. I love that phrase. This can foster self-reflection of the unconscious prejudice which keeps the oppressive system intact. So towards this end of seeking a more compassionate narrative, the gospel reading today offers some powerful insights to explore. In Jesus' day, there was an education system, much like we have an education system. And in this Jewish system in the first century, it had its moral center for the society in the temple, or the sacred story of liberation, of which the central characters found themselves. Now, a very basic sketch here. Beginning at the age of 6, Jewish children would enter what is called Bet Sephar, or House of the Book. They'd have classes 5 days a week where they would study the Hebrew Scriptures. And by the time they were age 10, they would have the first 5 books of the Bible completely memorized. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, all memorized. And the best of the best students advanced to the next level, while the majority of students went off to work on the family trade, like fishing or farming or carpentry, for example. And at the next level, for the few advancing, they entered what's called Bet Talmud, or House of Learning. They continued to study the Hebrew Scriptures, and between the ages of 10 and 14, they would have the entire Hebrew Bible memorized. The whole Torah and the whole prophets all memorized. We're thinking about incorporating this into our children's programming, so we're going to see how it's going to go this year. And at this stage, they also learned the art of questions and answers. Instead of answering with an answer, they were taught to answer questions with another question, hence developing what we would call critical thinking skills. They were taught to be curious about life and the scriptures and to question the narratives of the day. And after this stage, only the very fewest advanced to what is called Bet Midrash, or house of study. At this stage, the few students would be chosen to study with a rabbi. This is equivalent to the first century Ivy League school. And the rabbi would test the student up and down, and if he thought that he could become like him, the rabbi, he would say, "Come, follow me." And if not, then like the rest, like the majority, they would go back to the family business. Now, a question for us today. Who did Jesus call to be his disciples? He called fishermen and despised tax collectors, and he was a carpenter himself. These were students, most likely teenagers, who were 16 or 17 years old, who did not make the cut. They were not middle-aged men in robes with facial hair like we see in the Jesus movies. They were teenagers sent back to the family trade, rejects at worst, and certainly not the brightest and the best. We might say that Jesus challenged the high achievement narrative in his cultural context. I read an op-ed piece recently in the New York Times called "Best, Brightest, and Saddest?" The author, Frank Bruni, notes the increase in suicides, hospitalizations, and depression among teenagers in settings of very high achievement, of which certain parts of Pasadena would definitely qualify. He asked the question, are kids getting to be kids? Does a brand of hovering, exactingly prescriptive parenting put them in unforgiving boxes and prevent them from finding their own true selves and true grit? What a great question. And psychiatrist Adam Strasberg, also a father of two teenagers, wrote that while many parents are wealthy and secure beyond imagining, they're consumed by fear of losing that perch or failing to bequeath it to their children. And maintaining insidiously high educational standards is a way to soothe this anxiety. He concludes to say, want the best for your child, but not for your child to be the best, which is a big difference. And it's not just about parenting. These cultures of high achievement are the waters that many of us swim in. And this is not a bad thing at all, quite the opposite. Yet as we seek the best for our kids, we are challenged into constant, mindful engagement of our definitions of success. Spiritual writer Thomas Merton says that people may spend their whole life climbing a ladder of success, only to find out that when they reach the top, their ladder is leaning against the wrong wall. So at the cocktail party, whatever colleges are on the radar need not be the status symbols or the sources of shame. But can we commit to talking about our kids in terms of what they are passionate about their true selves, the best we know them to be? Can we undo the illusion that any child or school is the brightest and the best, but life is about fit, or finding where, in the words of Frederick Buechner, our deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet together? Jesus tells a different story, that imperfection, not being the best, and even failure is the necessary foundation on which true and compassionate self can be built. And he does this all in this gospel reading in the context of temple worship, in a gathering of worship. Now, one of the most effective means of forming a countercultural narrative in the emerging generation is by very young children to be in parts of this worship gathering on a regular basis. As they take in the sights and the smells and the sounds, the stories, the movements, kneeling at the altar rail or extending the peace, or learning about forgiveness and loving our enemies, and welcoming everyone around the table regardless of race, gender, sexuality, or religion. This is countercultural stuff that in the full humanity of young children can become their defining values as they go out into their various spheres of influence. Last week, we had lots of incense in the service for All Saints' Day, and when I was walking out of the church, I asked my 8-year-old Caleb what he thought about the incense, and he said, "I needed a gas mask." Now, incense can be very serious and reverent, and we talk about serious issues in this room which require our undivided grown-up attention. Yet there have been a couple isolated incidences in recent months where visiting young families experience some kind of meanness or annoyance from grown-ups because their children were not sitting still and hushed up for the duration of the service. And while all feelings are valid and understandable, we want to be clear this morning that children are radically welcome in this room every Sunday morning. If parents need to go out, there's a place that you can go to take care of your child. And grown-ups should feel free to take 100% responsibility to move wherever you feel most comfortable in this sanctuary. But as our children's minister has said, Laura, relax. God put the wiggle in children. You don't need to suppress it in God's house. We need the joy and levity. We need the gas mask. We need to remember our own inner child in our grown-up bodies. So if you see parents with children near you, you might encourage them a moment and say, "I'm so glad that you're here today. You are forming a counter-hegemonic narrative in your child that is going to change the world someday. You are such a blessing to me. Thank you so much." Can we do this? Because otherwise we might have to start a crying room for grown-ups, and we don't want to do that. I hope you feel the affection in my voice, sincerely. So finally, this morning, I want to talk about this widow in the story, the catalyzing figure in the account. I'm thinking to myself, what was her story that she came to find her voice and to know and believe in her own value where her culture would have said otherwise? In my third year of college, I was on a trajectory to become a public school teacher until I realized that this was not the vocation that had my name on it. And around that time, I went home for the summer, as I would, and I would normally get a painting or landscaping job in the summer. And my grandma Bonnie, who was somewhat of a saint in the city that I grew up in, she redirected my path by challenging me to start some kind of program for the kids in the neighborhood where she lived and worshiped. And she said she would pay me. So to make a long story short, I started a program for mentoring these at-risk kids, and there were 12 kids that I invested in for 3 years straight. And I went on to study urban ministry in seminary, focused on children at risk, where I later directed a small community mentoring program for kids here in Northwest Pasadena. For 8 years, I worked closely with children in poor settings before finding my own path into ordination in the Episcopal Church. Now, let me tell you about my Grandma Bonnie this morning. I called my parents this week to ask some questions about some parts of her story that I'd forgotten. And they shared with me an article that was written by an African-American journalist in the city I grew up in named Clayton Hardiman, an article that I really tuned into for the first time this week. Grandma Bonnie became the first official female leader in this urban church of which she was a part. She was seen as a trailblazer of her time, where in the late 1960s, the church had confronted a decision facing many others as well. It was a mostly white church in a racially diverse neighborhood. And the question was whether to flee to the suburbs where they might be more successful or to stay put. And the church chose to stay. And the author writes in this piece about her, the story goes back as far as the middle 1940s, after the end of World War II, when she went searching for a teaching job and found one in a poor part of the city where she taught for 40 years. But when Mrs. Dephouse goes back, she stops in 1971. And that was the year that her husband, Sidney Dephouse, at age 57, suffered a heart attack, and 24 hours later, he was gone. The couple had been married for 31 years with 3 children and having gone through 2 miscarriages and a stillborn together. She was a widow, a fact that I knew, but of which I became more conscious this week. The author goes on, his death transformed Bonnie Dephouse. It snatched her from a solid place and opened her heart up to raw agony. She says it made her a far more caring person. It came to a head after I lost my husband, she says. Losing your mate, there's no way to describe how much it hurts, losing someone who is a part of you. I had been hurt so badly myself, I became far more sensitive to other people's pain. The pastor of the church at the time testifies to Mrs. Dephouse's special talents. She brings to her job a number of personal relationships in the city, cultivated through years of teaching. People know Mrs. Dephouse, the pastor says. I go out into the black community and I'm just another white person, but she goes out and she's Bonnie Dephouse. A lot of people she knows are former students. He concludes, she believes she brings a certain toughness to the task, paired with compassion. What churches must offer to families in need, she believes, is not a Band-Aid, it's not a bailout. Above all, she says, we have the opportunity to help empower others to change their own lives. That's my Grandma Bonnie. Hope you don't mind me testifying a little bit about her this morning. Her voice of compassion was forged in the agony of her loss and grief. And she in turn redirected me onto my own path and helped many others as well. Now, I haven't worked closely with children at risk for a number of years now, so I speak to you today as an ally, as one who is self-reflecting on the risks of privilege as they relate to the far greater risks of poverty. For many of us in this room, we will continue to receive rewards, and we will continue to enter into wonderful opportunities, largely in part because of our class or because of the color of our skin. Where there are many today, especially children of color, who will continue to be overlooked and disregarded. Until we access our common humanity more deeply and interfere in this business in the tough and compassionate way of the rebel Jesus. This is just another step in the road this morning. Let's keep this discussion going. Amen.